They were the brightest stars of Hollywood's golden age, handsome, elegant, untouchable. But behind the fame and fanfare were secrets no script could cover, and lives shaped by fear, denial, and silence. Today, we uncover the most shocking allegations ever aimed at 10 legendary queer icons, truths hidden for decades, scandals whispered behind studio walls, and stories too dangerous to be told until now. Stay with us. You're about to see the golden age like never before. For decades, Rock Hudson stood as the picture of American masculinity. Towering in height and charm, he captured hearts around the world with every glance and smile. But behind that Hollywood ideal was a truth he had to bury deep, one that could destroy everything if revealed. Hudson's sexuality was one of the worst-kept secrets in Hollywood's inner circles, yet it remained untouched by the media for most of his career. He was encouraged by agents and studios to play the game, attend red carpet events with actresses, avoid close male friendships in public, and stay quiet at all costs. He followed those rules because in the 1950s and 60s, one slip could mean total career ruin. Then, in 1985, everything changed. When it was revealed that Hudson was battling a then-feared illness, headlines exploded. Not just about his health, but about the truth he'd been forced to keep silent for decades. His identity was no longer a whisper. It was now public, and the response was mixed. Some offered compassion, others accused him of deception, claiming he had endangered others by hiding his condition. But those criticisms ignored a brutal reality. Hudson had lived his life within an industry and society that gave him no safe choices. He stayed silent because silence was survival. He masked his truth not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. In his passing, Rock Hudson became something he never intended, a catalyst. His story forced a conversation about stigma, illness, and identity that Hollywood could no longer ignore. And as the curtain fell on his life, it lifted on an era of long-buried truths, finally coming to light. Up next is Liberace, a man who wore flamboyance like armor, but whose glittering image could not keep the lawsuits and secrets from crashing through his golden door. If Rock Hudson hid his truth in silence, Liberace buried his beneath rhinestones, lawsuits, and a smile that never cracked. The flamboyant pianist, beloved for his over-the-top performances and lavish lifestyle, dazzled millions with his capes, candelabras, and charisma. But beyond the sequins and showmanship, there lived a man waging a quiet war against a world that refused to accept who he was. For years, rumors about Liberace's sexuality swirled across tabloids and gossip columns, but instead of retreating into the shadows, he took an unexpected approach. He sued. When a British newspaper described him using a thinly veiled slur, he didn't just deny the implication, he dragged them into court and won. That victory became a warning to others. Speculate at your own risk. Yet the performance extended far beyond the stage. Liberace crafted an entire public persona of heterosexual innocence, often referring to his mother as the love of his life, and staging interviews that reinforced the illusion. But in private, his world was far more complicated and often painful. In the 1980s, the illusion began to crumble. Scott Thorson, a former live-in companion, filed a shocking lawsuit accusing Liberace of emotional manipulation, financial control, and even pressuring him into plastic surgery to resemble the entertainer himself. The lawsuit exposed a side of Liberace the public had never seen, one driven by fear, obsession, and a desperate need to control the narrative of his life. The case was eventually settled out of court, with no admission of wrongdoing, but the damage was done. The glitter had worn thin, and beneath it lay the loneliness of a man who spent a lifetime guarding a truth he was never allowed to live openly. As we leave the spectacle behind, we enter the shadows, into the brief and tragic life of Sal Mineo, whose fame burned bright, but whose end came far too soon and far too mysteriously. If Liberace masked his truth with extravagance, Sal Mineo simply ran out of places to hide. He was once Hollywood's golden boy, young, vulnerable, and heartbreakingly sincere in his breakthrough role as Plato in Rebel Without a Cause. Audiences saw his tenderness, his depth, and his pain. But behind the camera, Mineo's reality was even more fragile. As one of the first actors to portray emotionally complex young men, Mineo's career soared. Yet as he matured, the roles vanished. Hollywood had little room for a leading man who refused to fit the mold. especially ones surrounded by quiet whispers about his sexuality. Mineo never came out publicly, but he also never denied the truth to those closest to him. He lived discreetly, performing in theater and taking smaller roles, slowly rebuilding a life outside the glare of fame. But then in 1976, everything collapsed. Mineo was found lifeless in a dark alleyway behind his apartment, the victim of a brutal assault. The police called it a robbery gone wrong, but many questioned that conclusion. Close friends recalled how anxious and unsettled he had become in the weeks leading up to his passing. He had spoken of being followed, receiving strange phone calls, and feeling unsafe. Was it paranoia or something more? The tragedy sparked a wave of speculation. The media, hungry for scandal, hinted at dangerous liaisons and secret rendezvous. Rather than mourn him, they dissected him. The narrative became less about justice and more about innuendo. Sal Mineo's death was not just a loss, it was a warning. A reminder that being queer in Hollywood's golden age often meant living in fear, even when the lights had long faded. His was a life cut short not only by violence, but by the silence that surrounded it. Next, we follow that silence into the carefully constructed world of Raymond Burr, a man who rewrote his past to hide a truth he was never allowed to live. Sal Mineo's truth may have been taken from him, but Raymond Burr erased his truth before anyone else could get close. To the world, Burr was the embodiment of justice and integrity, the unshakable attorney in Perry Mason, the voice of reason in Ironside. Yet behind that calm, commanding presence was a carefully constructed narrative that hid more than it revealed. In interviews, Burr often spoke of a tragic personal life. He claimed to have lost a wife and a young son to illness, to have endured heartbreak that mirrored the scripts he acted out. The stories were detailed, convincing, and entirely fictional. There were no marriage records, no birth certificates, no photos. It was a life story crafted not by fate, but by design. So why lie? The answer may lie in who Burr truly shared his life with. Robert Benavides, his partner of over 3 decades. Officially labeled as a business associate, Benavides was by Burr's side through it all. They built a vineyard together, co-owned a production company, and shared a quiet domestic life far from the camera's gaze. But Burr never acknowledged him publicly, choosing instead to maintain the illusion of solitary sorrow. Some called it deception, others survival. In an era where even a hint of queerness could end a career, Burr chose to wrap his truth in tragedy. He gave the press a version of himself that was acceptable. Heartbroken, heroic, alone. Even in his later years, as societal attitudes began to shift, Burr refused to revise his past. He died as he lived, in control of his story, loyal to his silence. And in that silence, a deeply human love remained unseen, unnamed, yet quietly enduring. From the man who hid his love behind fiction, we now turn to one who tried to erase his truth from within. Anthony Perkins, forever etched in cinematic history, but shaped by a desperate attempt to become someone else entirely. If Raymond Burr rewrote his past to protect his truth, then Anthony Perkins tried to erase his truth altogether. Best known for his chilling performance as Norman Bates in Psycho, Perkins delivered one of the most iconic portrayals of inner torment ever captured on screen. But behind the scenes, his real torment was far more personal and just as haunting. From an early age, Perkins understood that being different came with consequences. In the rigid, moralistic landscape of 1950s Hollywood, being gay was not just a liability, it was a threat. Desperate to conform, he sought help in the form of conversion therapy, a now widely condemned practice that claimed it could cure same-sex attraction. Perkins underwent numerous sessions, believing that through psychological intervention he could become the version of himself that society demanded. At the same time, the studios that cast him fed the illusion. He was coached on how to speak, behave, and date. Public relationships with actresses were arranged. Tabloid photos were staged. Behind closed doors, Perkins remained conflicted, torn between who he was and who the world wanted him to be. Later in life, he married photographer Barry Berenson and had 2 sons. Some saw this as a final act of redemption. Others viewed it as a continuation of the mask he had worn for decades. Perkins himself never spoke openly about his sexuality, but those who knew him say the pain of suppression remained with him until the end. His story is not one of deception, but of survival. He wanted to act, to create, to be free. But freedom came with too high a price. So, like so many others, he compromised, hoping that silence might offer safety. And from a man battling himself, we move to a woman who allowed no one to question her. Barbara Stanwyck, the iron-willed icon who ruled both on screen and off with absolute control. While Anthony Perkins lived in fear of being discovered, Barbara Stanwyck built her empire on never letting anyone close enough to even try. She was a force of nature, sharp-tongued, commanding, and fiercely independent. With a career that spanned 5 decades and over 80 films, she became a legend of the silver screen. But behind that legend was a woman whose personal life remained a fortress. Throughout her life, Stanwyck kept her emotions tightly guarded. She rarely gave interviews and was known for ending conversations the moment they veered toward her private affairs. Rumors about her romantic life followed her for decades, particularly surrounding her deep relationships with other women, one of the most speculated being her longtime companion and personal assistant. Yet, no confirmation ever came. She neither denied nor admitted, and that silence became part of her power. Her marriage to actor Robert Taylor was viewed by many as a strategic move, orchestrated by studio executives to quell growing whispers about both their sexualities. Their relationship was professional, distant, and often strained. After their divorce, Taylor quickly remarried, while Stanwyck chose solitude, devoting herself entirely to her work. Colleagues often described her as intimidating, even cold. But perhaps it was not cruelty, it was protection. In an era where female stars were scrutinized more harshly than their male counterparts, Stanwyck understood that vulnerability could be weaponized, so she gave the world nothing to aim at. Her refusal to share her truth was not about shame, it was about control. She owned every piece of her image, never allowing gossip to define her. And to this day, her legacy remains untouched, not by scandal, not by confession, but by the sheer strength of her silence. But not every star could hold the line. Up next is Tab Hunter, the all-American heartthrob who followed the rules until the world exposed him anyway. Barbara Stanwyck kept her private life locked behind steel doors. Tab Hunter, by contrast, had the door ripped off its hinges, and the world came crashing in. With his perfect smile, sun-kissed hair, and boy-next-door charm, Hunter became one of the most bankable stars of the 1950s. He was the poster boy of American innocence. But behind that poster was a secret he carried like a ticking clock. Hunter played the game well. Studios arranged dates with actresses, set up photo ops, and crafted interviews that reinforced his straight-laced image. And for a while, it worked. He never confirmed anything, never rocked the boat. In private, he pursued quiet relationships with men, always cautiously, always discreetly. But in 1955, a tabloid article linked him to a years-old arrest at a private party labeled immoral. Though the charge was minor, the implication was seismic. Overnight, he went from Hollywood's golden boy to a liability. The studio scrambled, his PR team panicked, and roles began to disappear. For Hunter, it was not just the exposure, it was the betrayal. He had played by every rule, followed every unspoken code, and still, it was not enough. Hollywood had used his image, sold it, profited from it, and then discarded him when the illusion cracked. Years later, Hunter reclaimed his story in a memoir that pulled back the curtain with grace, honesty, and surprising humor. He never asked for pity, only for the dignity that had once been denied him. This story is a reminder that silence is not always protection. Sometimes it is a leash, and once it snaps, there is no going back. From the boy next door whose truth was stolen, we now journey to Dirk Bogarde, a man who chose silence, not because he had to, but because he loved too deeply to risk it all. If Tab Hunter's truth was stolen from him, Dirk Bogarde kept his truth tucked safely away. For over 40 years. Bogarde was the epitome of the refined leading man, articulate, elegant, and deeply intellectual. But behind his eloquence was a choice that defined his life. Not to speak, not to confess, and not to risk the love he quietly shared. For decades, Bogarde lived with Anthony Forwood, his manager, companion, and by many accounts, the love of his life. They shared homes in Europe, raised dogs together, and even nursed one another through illness. Yet neither man ever publicly acknowledged the nature of their relationship. In interviews, Bogarde would refer to Forwood vaguely, sometimes only as a dear friend. His fans suspected, journalists speculated, but Bogarde never gave them a headline. He never needed to. Silence was his way of protecting not just his career, but the person he held closest. To go public would have meant exposing Forwood, and that, for Bogarde, was unthinkable. Even in his autobiographies, written with wit and wisdom, he danced around the subject. There were glimpses, quiet reflections, hidden meanings, but never an outright declaration. He left clues, not confessions. Their love story ended as quietly as it began. Forwood passed first, and Bogarde followed some years later. No scandals, no exposés, just two lives intertwined in silence. Dirk Bogarde's story is not one of fear. It is one of quiet courage, of choosing love over legacy, of understanding that in his time, truth was not just risky, it was dangerous. And so, he loved in secret, hoping that maybe one day the world would be kinder than the one he knew. And from the man who preserved his love with silence, we now turn to Ramón Novarro, a star from the silent era, whose life ended not in secrecy, but in violence, and whose legend was twisted beyond recognition. Dirk Bogarde protected love through silence, but Ramón Novarro's silence could not save him. Once hailed as one of Hollywood's original Latin lovers, Novarro captivated audiences in the silent film era with his smoldering eyes and romantic roles. But when the applause faded and the cameras stopped rolling, he was left alone, with a legacy he could not outrun and a truth he was never allowed to live freely. Novarro lived a quiet, reclusive life in his later years. The rumors surrounding his sexuality had always followed him, but he never publicly addressed them. Close friends knew. Industry insiders whispered. Still, Novarro, ever graceful, never confirmed nor denied. Perhaps he believed that with discretion came safety. But in 1968, that illusion was shattered. He was found lifeless in his Los Angeles home, the victim of a brutal assault. Two young men had entered his house under false pretenses, convinced he kept large sums of money hidden. What began as a robbery turned horrific. The violence shocked the public, but instead of focusing on justice, the tabloids pounced on his private life. Speculation exploded. Gossip columns painted him as a lonely old star chasing dangerous company. They focused more on how he lived than how he died. The tragedy became a scandal. His legacy was tarnished not by his choices, but by a media hungry for sensationalism. In truth, Novarro had lived with dignity. He had loved, feared, and aged in a world that saw his identity as taboo. His passing revealed not his flaws, but the cruelty of a culture that refused to protect him. He wasn't destroyed by desire, but by the myth that had once made him famous. And now we reach our final chapter, a legend frozen in time. James Dean, the rebel without a cause, and a truth never fully revealed. Ramón Novarro's truth was twisted in his passing. James Dean's, on the other hand, was buried with him, unfinished, unspoken, and eternally unresolved. In just 3 films, Dean became an icon. With his slouched posture, wounded eyes, and mumbled rebellion, he captured a generation's discontent. But behind the legend of the rebel without a cause was a young man who never had the chance to fully reveal himself. Dean's personal life was a maze of contradictions. Friends described him as emotionally open, yet frustratingly guarded. Some said he was romantically involved with both men and women. Others insisted he refused labels altogether. He never publicly addressed his sexuality, but neither did he try very hard to hide. He was seen in the company of male companions as often as female ones, often blurring the line between intimacy and friendship. One of his most quoted lines, spoken privately to a friend, was, "I refuse to go through life with one hand tied behind my back." Many believe it was his way of pushing back against society's expectations, not just in art, but in identity. Still, in the 1950s, even subtle defiance came at a cost. Though rumors swirled, Dean never gave Hollywood the scandal it feared, or perhaps craved. While his contemporaries either masked their truth or fled from it, Dean stood somewhere in between, elusive yet suggestive. He was a paradox in motion, living just enough on the edge to raise questions, but not quite enough to answer them. In that liminal space, he became both a symbol and a mystery, one that critics and fans have tried to decode for generations. Then, just as his star was rising, it ended. In 1955, at only 24, James Dean died in a car crash that cemented his legend. No confessions, no redemption, no unraveling of the mystery, just endless speculation frozen in time. In his passing, Dean became more than a movie star. He became a symbol of freedom, of tragedy, of unrealized truth. He remains a mirror onto which every generation projects its own longing, rebellion, and questions. Perhaps that's why James Dean still haunts us, not for who he was, but for who we never got to know. His legacy is not carved in clarity, but in shadows, and maybe that is what makes it eternal. Their names lit up marquees, their faces filled movie screens, but their truths were locked away, buried under contracts, lies, and survival. If their stories moved you, share this video so their silence was not in vain. Which story struck you most? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold legacies from LGBTQ+ history. The truth matters, and together, we keep it alive.